Well, welcome back to Open to Truth, a podcast all about exploring big ideas and discovering truth together. My name's Clint.
Hi, I'm Tony. Welcome back.
Just trying to
it's good.
Flare it up a little bit.
Yeah, that's good. You're really getting into it. Glad to be here.
Yes. Today, I'd like to talk about myth and story in scripture and matters of faith.
What do you mean? There are no myths.
Okay, so what do we mean by myth? Yeah, I mean, there's a popular show called Mythbusters.
Yeah.
Where, what they mean by myth is there's this saying going around.
Something people believe that's actually not true.
Right.
That's what a myth is. Like Snopes.com.
Yes.
Bust your myths.
But that's not how I'm using it.
No, okay.
It means more, and some nerdy literary analyst would quibble between all these terms, but folklore, legend, fantasy, fairy tale, myth, story. I think of myth as, or then you can latch on like historical myth or historical legend, and the categories can get wonky. But I think what I mean is a tried and true story that usually contains some kind of divine figure or heroic element meant at capturing a objectively true or culturally important
like an ethos, like Aesop's fables are trying to convey some moral truth. Because you just rattled off a bunch like fairy tale, fantasy.
Yeah.
None of those scream to me they happened historically. I think, made up story.
How about legend?
Legend, it might have. Something happened, but we don't know what. Legend is something that, some sailor tells in a bar about what happened on the seas, and the story grows over years.
Yeah. So just on my brief, maybe we will get into that nerdy literary analyst thing, but the key difference I saw between the definition of myth and legend is strictly human events.
Okay.
And a myth would usually include a supernatural element.
Okay.
A legend could include a supernatural element, but it always involves a human being as a main character of it.
Yeah.
King Arthur's court, and here's this weird mystical sword in the stone and Merlin. You know what I mean? But so there's supernatural elements, but it's about this purported human being. Whereas a myth could be, include the goings on of the Egyptian gods of Osiris and Horus and Ra. Where there's not a clear, you know what I mean? There's not a clear person that they're pointing to.
Yes.
Even if in the legend the person didn't really exist, we could wonder about, did King Arthur exist and the historical analog?
Yeah.
But that would be the main distinction between those.
Right. So when you say that a myth is designed to point out truth, it's not necessarily historical truth.
No, yeah, it could be
so much as it is
theological, moral, psychological.
Yeah.
There's some deep truth of the world that the myth is trying to capture in narrative story form.
So why is this on your mind? Why have you been thinking about this?
Well, because it's an open question how much myth is contained in the Christian faith.
Is there myth in the Bible, you mean?
Yeah, I guess so.
Or should you think about the Bible or parts of the Bible as myth?
Well, I know for a fact that some people would say yes, and there's been a whole school of hermeneutics or interpretive efforts called demythologizing. A demythologizing hermeneutic. So it's assuming that there's myths in there, and you're trying to remove away the mythical elements to get at the nugget of theological, practical, moral truth embedded in the story.
Why would you need to do away with the mythological elements to get at the truth? Isn't the whole point of them being there to point you to this truth?
Or rather, so in the interpretive project where you're trying to discern what are all and only the true propositions that I can infer from the story.
Okay.
I am taking away the mythological elements to avoid making inferences that have supernatural consequences. So it's for someone that is
I see.
Deeply committed to the Enlightenment, hyper-rationalist project,
Yep.
scientific age. There's no room for supernatural.
Even though there might still be benefit to maybe the moral truths or meanings of the story, the project you're describing is trying to get at that without having to onboard a metaphysic of...
Let's take an example.
Yes, please.
Yep. In the Gospels, a number of times you have Jesus feeding the multitude, 5,000, 3,000, usually from a small amount of food.
Yeah.
And the story, I think everyone's in agreement that the story says, or like the author was trying to communicate that a miracle happened.
Right.
There was a few loaves and a few fish that were miraculously multiplied into bushels of whole buckets of extras to feed this whole crowd of people. Okay.
Yep.
So how to interpret that? Well, maybe a literalist or maybe a more classical traditional view would say, oh, that is a report of something that really happened. Like Jesus was a miracle worker and supervened or interfered with the laws of nature as they currently stand. Like you and I can't just go upstairs and multiply the home pride loaf, right? So he somehow has power over that, and that really did happen. Okay.
Yeah.
The more rationalist, maybe more austere type of interpretive project would be to say, to try to find a sequence of natural events that explain the story. So
got it.
So there are, I forget some of the names of the scholars, but like in the 1800s, biblical scholars might have said something like, oh, each person got a little crumb of the 5 loaves. Okay.
Wow.
So that in that way, they all got a little morsel, and it was to foreshadow the Eucharist and how we all do that now with little crumbs of bread.
Sure.
Okay. So see how it wasn't trying to like say the story didn't happen, but it was giving naturalistic.
Would this be the same as...
But now, just real quick, then the third thing, the demythologizing project is different.
Oh.
That's saying, that's not trying to find like that naturalistic explanation. They think that's ridiculous. The author meant to describe a miraculous event. However, the modern man cannot accept a supernatural hypothesis to explain things. So let's do away with that miraculous part of the story. And what's like the real theological, moral, important claim being made? What would it be in this case? Something like, I don't know.
God provides, or share with your neighbor, or I don't know.
Yeah, great things can come from small packages. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So see how all those are approaches to how you would interpret a passage, and each have philosophical commitments.
Yep.
The latter two, notably, disallow supernatural hypotheses to help explain or interpret an event.
Yeah. And so I can see there being some benefit I can see why you would want to engage in some demythologizing.
Yes,
If something seems particularly far-fetched, it's just tough to swallow. Man, that's really in the story? They're really saying that happened? A talking snake or a talking donkey or whatever it happens to be. Like, there's some wild stories in scripture. And it can be tough to suspend your disbelief sometimes. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge the author is really seeming to indicate that a miracle took place here.
So the demythologizer recognizes that.
Yeah.
But also recognizes we're in this new era. So here's the motivation for that view, I don't want to paint a straw man.
Yeah.
So they would say, look, Tony, you demythologize about everything else. In fact, that's because you are a descendant in the era of the scientific revolution. The scientific method came about where we can test our claims and make hypotheses and find out what's not working or working for our scientific theories, and look at all of the dead spiritual entities left in the wake of the scientific revolution that have just not they've not pulled their weight explanatorily, or they're no longer necessary. One classic example is phlogiston.
Sure.
Phlogiston was a pre-modern supposed spiritual substance in everything
Wow.
that explained why something burned. If
The
it
amount of
produced a larger
phlogiston.
flame, it had more phlogiston. If it burned less, it had not as much. And that's fine as far as it goes. Like it did the work it needed to in the theory.
Yeah.
But now we found out about the oxygen molecule and combustion. And the modern theory of combustion relegated phlogiston
Doesn't
to the
need phlogiston.
graveyard of spiritual entities.
Yeah.
And there are a number of those. Even within theology, we don't have to just stay in science. Before monotheism really took off,
Yeah.
the ancient mind populated their metaphysical world with a host of personalities.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look at the Greek pantheon of gods.
So many. How
And-
many? Do you know?
No, I mean, it would be different depending on who you ask.
Really? Okay.
But yeah, just think back to if you've seen the Disney Hercules, and
Yeah.
there's Hermes and Aphrodite, Zeus, and Hera, and all of them.
And they've all got their little dramas playing out and going.
Yeah, so those are like kind of demigods maybe, and
Yeah.
they're a weird kind of hybrid between a mortal and a god. But over time, barring like Eastern traditions for a moment, the Western world has slowly demythologized as a whole. Our religions have become less populous
Mhm.
in terms of their spiritual entities. Our understanding of the natural world has become less spiritual.
Right.
And so right now we currently, at least it's advised by even some like well-thinking, godly scientists,
Yeah.
would say, no, it's good that we have a method for understanding the world that doesn't allow supernatural explanations.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask is
Methodological naturalism.
yes. And that shouldn't we adopt a naturalistic explanation where one is possible and likely? Like if we can come up with an explanation. Okay.
Mhm.
I should probably not jump to the conclusion that there's a ghost in my house when my ceiling creaks at night. There's probably some other explanation for whatever noise I'm hearing. It's likely wind or it's expansion from temperature and things are creaking.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good for me to look for a naturalistic explanation before I jump to the gods did it, the ghosts
Why is
did
that?
it.
What motivates that axiom, that principle of interpretation?
It's a good question. It just seems more in line with reality. It seems like I could come up with all kinds of crazy explanations for anything that happens,
Yeah.
and be completely out of touch with reality.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how to answer it other than that. It just seems good to be in touch with reality.
Is it called? I forget. I might be bombing this, so I apologize to my philosopher friends. I think it's something like the LGM theory of everything.
Oh, I don't know.
Little green men.
Oh, okay.
So little no-seum little green men that are indetectable
Yeah.
are responsible for whatever.
Yeah.
And you could do that for anything.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no actual independent reason to suppose that the world is like that at all.
Right.
So that is troublesome.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem like, for someone who values one's beliefs to be truth apt, to
Mhm.
be directed at or aimed at the truth, the way the world really is, to allow a supposition of a supernatural force without just cause.
Yeah.
And that's the real thing, is when do you have just cause?
Right.
That's
Right.
where the flashpoint is.
So if we say that it's good, where possible, to adopt a naturalistic explanation, what is the cost to this demythologizing? Why shouldn't we demythologize as
Well,
much as possible?
And even another good on top of this is look how much good was produced in the world
Right.
when we did make the shift into methodological naturalism.
Mm-hmm. We
and just
really
by
made
that term, I
progress.
mean, when I engage in my scientific rationale, I am disallowed from helping myself to a supernatural explanation.
Yep.
Now, this does not say that, what this is not saying is never make a supernatural hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
This is saying sorry, I'm stuffy.
It's okay.
When you are doing science, when you are engaging in the discipline of science, use methodological naturalism.
Yep.
You can, maybe we have a different rubric for when we do theology and philosophy and
But at least
cosmology.
within science, that's how science is done.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
When we did away with phlogiston, we were able to figure things out, like combustion engines.
Yes.
And
So there's tons of good that's come from it.
yeah.
Is there bad? Have we lost anything? Why not demythologize as much as you can in all areas?
So let's say I don't think we've lost a lot in the realm of science.
Mm-hmm.
What has happened, here's a cost to the scientific revolution, is the project of science has been replaced often in folks' minds by scientism. And that is the priority of science epistemologically above all other disciplines.
Right.
That is, you are more justified in the conclusions of science than you are any other discipline. And and that itself is a philosophical claim. That's not scientific, ironically.
Yeah.
So that's been, and I view that view as false, scientism, and we should equally respect other disciplines like history or theology or philosophy and not make science primary. That's been a effect of the scientific revolution.
Yep.
But in terms of our theology now, let's just shift there. That little excursus on science was just to showcase what we mean by demythologizing. Bringing that to the theology world, well, there's a host of examples, like you mentioned, in the Bible that trade on supernatural causes. Balaam's talking donkey. Oh my gosh. I feel dumb even listing them. There's so many.
There's heaps. Yeah, there's heaps of stuff. There's seas parting and plagues and resurrections and healings and talking animals, the sun standing still.
And so I guess the question you'd want to ask is, what would be bad or what would be costly in using the hermeneutic of demythologizing on any example in scripture or in a faith tradition? So let's just rifle through some examples. I mean, the loaves and the fish one, great things come out of small gifts or something, or even like something like the resurrection. This is just a playing out of the deep archetype of humanity of death and resurrection and dying to an old self and a new self. We see that playing out in the human story in our own lives, like the hero's journey. This is just the hero's journey. This didn't actually happen, or that would be like the strategy of what they're talking about. Jesus walking on water. Again, the rationalists would say, oh, when that happened, he just was walking on a sandbar and it looked like he was on water. And that's why they wrote it. No, that's not what the author meant. Like the disciples thought he was walking on water, and the demythologizer says something like, oh, they wanted to communicate that God, it just has authority or sovereignty over the cosmos or something.
So what's the cost of taking that approach?
Yeah, the cost would be you might miss out on something that really did happen that was supernatural. When you buy fiat or just by declaration say, we're not going to allow any supernatural explanation, then if that were the case, you'd miss it because you're not allowed to use it in your investigation.
Are there examples you can think of that aren't easily demythologized, or like examples, say in scripture, where a supernatural explanation really does seem to be the best one?
Yeah, man. The biggest one for me is probably the resurrection.
Sure. It's a big one.
Of Jesus.
It's one of the bigger ones in the Bible,
Yeah. Probably next to that, I don't know if it holds the same weight or it's pretty close, but just the idea of creation.
Sure. Yeah.
I still find myself convinced that needs to be a supernatural event in some way, just almost by definition. But unless it's always existed or it's popped into existence from the multiverse or something wild. But
because to demythologize the resurrection, you would be saying that the writers wanted to convey the idea of Jesus coming back to life, but you don't need to be committed that actually happened historically at all.
And just to be clear too, like, if they're building that in, like, we if the demythologizer is at the same time saying you cannot think that this historically happened, now there's more of a problem. But just the idea, like what I said earlier, of this is the human archetype of the hero's journey playing out, that's fine to say.
Yeah.
The question is, like, in addition, did it really happen?
Did it actually happen though?
And I think it's a mistake for the hard-lined demythologizer to rule that out at the outset.
Sure.
Just because of other reasons.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I find the resurrection details recalcitrant. They are resistant to undermining.
Yeah. I mean, this
alternative explanations of this story that has been propagated are weak, in my opinion.
Can we walk through some? Because this was one of the main wings in my sort of polemic defense of Christianity that I had sort of up my sleeve with natural theology and arguments and stuff. Resurrection was very essential. If you were the Iron Man suit, this was one of the main weapons on your arsenal. Yeah. Or when people, especially to answer the question, okay, maybe Kalam, cosmological argument, maybe that gets you God vaguely.
Sure.
Why Christianity?
Yep.
You know, and it's like, well, let's look at the resurrection of Jesus. So yeah, can we walk through some of the alternate theories of what went on there?
Sure. And I know in the literature they all have like proper names and stuff for this theory, but we can just kind of speak of it casually. So I guess the hidden body theory would be one. So again, just maybe we're jumping the gun. The story of the resurrection.
Well, I think Craig does it this way, if I may. Channel my inner Craig.
Yeah.
There's 5 facts, historically agreed upon facts.
Oh, great.
That need explaining. They demand explaining. I'll see if I can rattle them off. Jesus was crucified publicly. He died and was buried, or appeared dead and was buried in a tomb. 3 days later, the tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. The disciples then, and others, claimed to have appearances of seeing Jesus alive, and that the disciples all were martyred for that belief and defending that belief. So those 5 things need explaining.
Well done.
And yeah, I think that's right. Correct me if I'm wrong, any fellow Craigian acolytes, but I think that's right. And so then we're left with, okay, well, how can we explain those 5 things? What possible explanations are there?
And his whole shtick is each of the alternatives don't do a great job of one of those 5.
One of those, yeah. There's a weak spot somewhere in each of the theories.
So the hidden body theory. So is that
like a stolen body theory?
Yeah. The disciples, I guess, ransacked the tomb,
right? So
and took the body, and
you don't have any report of that from the guards. So the tomb was guarded. So if the disciples somehow overpowered 2 Roman guards and stole the body, it also doesn't explain why they went to their deaths defending what they knew to be a lie. You know, if they were being martyred for their claims that Jesus had risen from the dead and was Lord, and they knew, actually, we just stashed his body in a back alley somewhere, it's unlikely that they would all stay committed to that upon pain of death, but they did.
Right.
So the origin of the disciples' faith. That's what he calls
and at least, well, just to be fair, I think some of the stories of the disciples are fairly legendary.
Yeah.
I think Peter,
like the crucified upside down thing.
I think that's the one that we know
the most
more about than like Thomas being flayed in India or something.
Right.
There's just less. I mean, how did they?
Right. So there was apparent death theory. That Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, but instead, like in the tomb, resuscitated and sort of crawled his way out, I guess, and somehow moved the stone and got past the guards or whatever. I think the main sort of critique there is a bloodied and weak Jesus is hardly the image of the Messiah that would, garner the conclusion, oh, he rose from the dead, as opposed to like, oh, he's just barely hanging on to life, after he's been flayed and hung on a cross for however long.
And then what's the story there? So in that story, he would then go into hiding after the story of the ascension and was never seen from again.
Yeah, I guess became a hermit.
Yeah,
and disappeared. Hallucination theory that he didn't. It doesn't explain the empty tomb really. It's just an attempt to explain the appearances.
Yeah.
That they were so traumatized by what happened to Jesus and obviously huge Jesus fans that they had psychotic episodes and thought they saw Jesus. but that just leaves some of these other things
Yeah.
unexplained.
And so, if I'm being totally honest, like as you're rattling these off, I don't find that any of those theories are like, oh, that absolutely couldn't be the alternative. Maybe one of them is, and it's just unlikely. I mean, that happens all the time in history, that the unlikely explanation is in fact the right one. I mean, that can be the case.
Yeah.
I mean, that happened. Think of how often that happens with like court cases that get overturned decades later. Like someone got sentenced to death row, and then upon learning about DNA, and they went back and looked at the old cases and did DNA forensic evidence, like, oh, he was innocent. But like at the time, like the most likely situation was that he did it. That guy that was sentenced, and then evidence came in to the contrary that was unlikely, but
So I think the atheist's claim there would be that any naturalistic explanation is more likely than a supernatural explanation. So even the most unlikely natural explanation or naturalist explanation should be the one you adopt. It's more likely than the supernatural one.
Yeah, interesting. What do you make of that? I mean, that's a philosophical claim about epistemology.
This is where Craig goes into background information and context. Like he has independent reasons for thinking that there is a God who would have interest in raising Jesus from the dead. You sort of bring that to the table of the story of resurrection. So if you're excluding supernatural events outright, that's a position that you bring to that. It's not an explanation, you know?
Yeah.
That in itself is a conclusion that needs defending. So, yeah.
So the cost of demythologizing the resurrection is that, well, yeah, what if that actually happened and you've ruled that out? Now, we've picked an example that it seems like it has very great import on the Christian faith and theology. So even in the previous episode, talking about the concept of God as rescuer from the human predicament of death, even if you take that concept, at least for me, like when I utilize that, that's doing a lot of, the resurrection is playing a large role in
your hope there.
Yeah, and the candidate of Jesus as this God as rescuer.
Right.
I appreciate the fact that he's an individual that appears to have conquered death.
Conquered it.
And not merely mythologically played out the role of the hero.
Yeah.
It matters that it really happened, and that an
if
individual...
you want it to really happen.
Right.
Or anything like it.
Yes.
Yeah.
That matters to me a lot.
Yes.
Now, something like the story of Jonah, of being swallowed by a fish and taken down to the depths of chaos in the ocean. Okay, now this is less central to, I don't need that, or I don't want to say need, that was the wrong word.
Okay.
I want to have said, it is not of vital importance that have historically occurred. In fact, that whether it historically occurred or not doesn't make one lick of difference to me in the importance of the message that the story of Jonah is carrying.
Or in the existential problem you're seeking to solve as a religious inquirer. Like, not much hangs on the historicity of Jonah's being tossed overboard on a ship.
Yeah.
But
because I'm assuming that it's impossible for us to find out at this point,
right,
through natural means,
right,
that occurred.
I don't know I don't know how we would.
And I don't know, I guess what would be gained if it were discovered is that, this scriptural story is corroborated by a thing that happened. But the details of the story would be the things that were corroborated. What can't be corroborated and what is actually important, in my opinion, is the theological message.
The message of the story
is... And again, like, I don't know, something like God has forgiveness for everyone, even the wicked Assyrians.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Interesting. So it just depends. In some cases, you stand to lose quite a bit by demythologizing. In other cases, not so much.
I think that's right. And we should not take a policy of one size fits all when it comes to this. So I disagree with the demythologizer that disallows supernatural explanation. And I disagree with the face value traditionalists that it has to have historically happened exactly like it said.
Yeah.
You know,
They're both different approaches and tools.
I'm fine with an author having helped himself to mythological, supernatural elements to tell a story.
Yeah.
What I'm more interested in is, I guess it does come back to that from that existential perspective of the inquirer who wants to know what the world is really like and be rescued from their predicament. Does this matter to that extent?
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, or maybe even in the web of beliefs of one's worldview, if it's a peripheral strand, then maybe I'm ambivalent or I'm agnostic on the question of historicity, and I'm interested in what the mythologizer has to say. But if it's a central node, like a resurrection, and maybe there's other ones you'd want to throw in there, creation event,
Right.
then I'm far more dubious of, just demythologize it.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Is that helpful? I mean,
That's good. Yeah.
As far as when you go to approach the scripture and you're like, oh, what a wild, wacky story. What do I do? I mean, maybe you feel embarrassed
Yeah.
that your faith tradition endorses
This is in there?
a book that says that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And here are these schools of thought, and it's not crazy for you to look for those higher order theological moral principles embedded in the story. And you don't have to be committed to like this historically happened, nor do you have to be committed that it didn't happen.
Right.
In some cases. And it's up
Sometimes
to
it's
us,
besides the point, actually.
it's up to us in community to discern where those different cases lie on that spectrum.
Yeah. That's good.
Well, thanks for listening to another episode of Open to Truth. Hope you enjoyed that. We'd love to hear from you if you have
We would.
any questions on like which particular how would you handle a particular biblical story. We've been kind of toying with the idea of going through tough Bible stories.
Yeah.
So which ones are
Is there one that's stumping
screaming out to you?
You just can't quite swallow that wild thing happened?
Yeah.
Or have you come to see a story? Maybe you have a great naturalistic explanation for a story, some Bible thing that's in there that would be really interesting to us to hear. I'd love to know that as well.
You can write in at mailbag@opentotruth.com. We also write about these ideas each week on the blog.
That's right.
That's a great way to share this with a friend because not everyone's going to just automatically listen to a hour-long podcast, but they might read a 3-minute blog.
Yeah.
So I'd really appreciate it if you enjoy this content. Subscribe to the blog. You can do that opentotruth.com/subscribe and see if you find it valuable first. And if you do, then take that next step and share it with a friend.
Perfect. We'd love that. Well, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time. Stay curious.